really wonderful listening to all these presentations. And I several of you know that the sparks are just going off as I hear these little connections going back and forth. It's wonderful. I'm very privileged to introduce Norm Sims. And I want to tell you why. I want to share with you a little anecdote. All of my formal education is in literature. But finding myself unemployed when I finished college, I became a journalist. And then I'd periodically go back and get another. When I was formally studying literature, there was one thing we always understood, and that was that journalism could never be literature. I even had an English professor say to me, "Journalism can't be literature." And then when I'd be in the newsroom, you know, my city editors, they would say, "You know, we don't write literature. Come on, you have to, you know, the facts, who, what, when, where, how, why, you know, the usual objectified kind of stuff," which actually I enjoyed doing. I don't want to knock it too much. Well, then I got into teaching in the late 1980s, teaching journalism, and at a small American college, and I inherited a course I'd never taught before. It was called rather blandly Readings in Journalism. It wasn't called literary journalism. But the textbook for it was very interesting. It was Norm Sims' first anthology, The Literary Journalist, 1984, I believe. Yes. And I picked this up. I had to teach it. I started reading it, and I said, journalism can be literature, and literature can be journalism. It was such an illumination. I know I'm not the only one who's had that experience. I know numerous people have told Norm this. And for me, number one, it gave me my area of research, and I suppose it gave me finally that direction in life I was looking for. And then I went on to discover his other books. Later in the, it was later in the 80s, wasn't it? Let's see, Literary Journalism in the 20th Century. It's Oxford University. 1990. 1990, okay. 1990, which became very much a pillar for my own work that I've done. And then still later in the 90s, another anthology, Literary Journalism. And by the way, Norm is going to be having a book published later this year called True Stories, A Century of Literary Journalism, focusing on the American experience, I guess. Yeah. But here's why I think Norm is important. You know, not only because I discovered him, and I know lots of others have, but as we begin to understand that there's this strange stuff called literary journalism out there in the world, and as many of you from your own countries, you know, are starting to explore, we all know that the academy is slow to change. You know, they have these disciplinary blinders, and it's difficult sometimes to see beyond them. Norm had a lot of courage back in the 1980s to take this on as his area of research, and you know that he was willing to do this because very, very few people were doing it. A dozen years ago in the United States, there weren't that many people who were researching this. It was kind of a lonely endeavor, and I was talking with Sonja Zdvoch from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And she said that's how she has felt in Slovenia. Well, Norm has been there. And he is certainly an example of what can be done. And with that, I'm not going to say anymore. I want to turn it over to really the person I consider to be the senior scholar of this form of scholarship in the United States. Thank you, Norm.
I'm asked to come to the conference. My work has been concentrated on the practices shared by literary journalists, and actually that began in graduate study when I was looking at reporting in Chicago in the 1890s. So I was interested in some of the presentations this morning about that period late in the 19th century, early in the 20th century, because that's where I first discovered this stuff. But today, rather than talking about history, I want to talk about the future. And I think there are some challenges to literary journalism that are happening right now, at least in the United States, that may shape its future. Just to take a step backward for a moment, there was a fellow named Joseph North, who was the editor of the New Masses, a left-wing journal in Greenwich Village in New York, who in 1935 had a pretty good understanding of how important literary journalism was. He said literary journalism, or what at that time was called reportage, was three-dimensional reporting. Quoting, he said, "The writer not only condenses reality, he helps the reader feel the fact. The finest writers of reportage are artists in the fullest sense of the term. They do their editorializing through their imagery." I think if North were alive today to look at the state of the world, he would find literary journalism or reportage just as important now as it was during the Great Depression in the 1930s. But I wonder how and where it's going to survive in the future. I must take a break at the moment to explain that my understanding of international literary journalism is weak. So as I'm making these brief comments this morning, oh look, I just fell off the table.
Not a good future.
Could this be a sign? While I'm talking, I'd appreciate it if you would think about the experience of literary journalism in your own country at the moment. And in a few minutes, I'll ask you to add your thoughts to this conversation about the future of literary journalism. And I hope we can make it a conversation about the future of international literary journalism. The context is this. At no time in American history has literary journalism ever been a primary form of journalism. By the 1920s, standard objective journalism had pushed the literary ambitions of reporters aside in a thorough way. Standard objective journalism had achieved dominance, and it would remain that way. There have been a few moments that were turning points in the craft of literary journalism, and they include a number of things: the rise of mass circulation, urban newspapers in the 1890s, reporting on World War I, expatriate American writers traveling in Europe after World War I, writing about what they found there, the reporting in America on the Great Depression of the 30s, and so forth. There have been several such moments. But compared to standard journalism during those time periods and at those turning points, literary journalism was never a dominant form. It was in fact done by very few people. So compared to journalism's meat and potatoes dinner, I think literary journalism was nothing more than the spices sprinkled on the food during the 20th century. Right now we may be at another turning point. It's a little hard to declare these things historically at the moment when they're happening. But at least in American literary journalism, writers face some challenges that I'll briefly discuss. I think it also may be an opportunity for international literary journalists to take the lead in the form that has been, in my limited view, dominated by Americans to this point. There's good and there's bad news in every category. Let's start with some bad news. The primary challenge, I think, today may be more economic than literary. And just to look at the several primary forms that literary journalism takes, the places where it's published. First of all, newspapers. There's good news and bad news here, both. Several newspapers have taken narrative to heart, particularly the Oregonian and the St. Petersburg Times. Some have narrative units within their staff where writers will be assigned for a certain period of time to learn how to use narrative in news reporting and to produce some stories. Some analysts see narrative journalism as a way of allowing the newspaper to survive in America, essentially attracting readers with literature rather than shopping coupons. And I think the new attention to narrative testifies to the strength of a literary form in journalism. John Hartsock has been doing some work on this, and I think something is being published in Prose Studies, in August.
That was the paper I gave at this conference last year.
It's not all good news. Even at newspapers that establish a narrative unit, or at places like the Oregonian, literary journalism still faces the traditional problems and traditional limits that have always been there at newspapers. First of all, papers generally cannot afford the time to assign a writer to a long piece of literary journalism. Once the piece is written, they cannot afford the space that it would take up in the pages of the newspaper. And third, both issues relate to the amount of money that a newspaper can spend on literary journalism. So there's some promise there, but it still has real challenges. The second area is in magazines, which has always seemed to be the strength of literary journalism, its core. The great oasis for literary journalism in the desert of objective reporting was the New Yorker, from its founding in the 1920s up through at least through the 1980s and into the 1990s. The original editors, Harold Ross and what's his name? William Shawn. We were joking about this morning. Had an artistic vision for fact writing. Their magazine was a cathedral that was built around the idea of nonfiction writing. And as it turned out, a great deal of that was literary journalism. They brought so many people to the staff, to name just a few of them: Janet Flannery, Joseph Mitchell, A.J. Liebling, Lillian Ross, John McPhee, Calvin Trillin, and more recently, but also within Sean's period as editor, Mark Singer, Ian Fraser, Susan Orlean. Today, some of those literary journalists are still at the New Yorker. Singer is there, Susan Orlean, even McPhee is still publishing things. But only rarely does their work or the work of others achieve the level of literary journalism, which was pretty easy to find in previous years at the New Yorker. The hot news staff writers at the New Yorker are closer to essayists than they are to literary journalism. I'm thinking of people such as Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote a book called The Tipping Point and another one called Blink. A very good writer, but he's an essayist. The ones who carry the narrative portfolio at the New Yorker, writers such as Catherine Boo and Larissa McFarquhar, typically only treat the skills of literary journalism and of narrative writing as a way to make social policy points. So in some respects, they're closer to the reportage that Joseph North talked about in the 1930s. They will use narrative structures, but generally only as an example of something in a point made about social policy. The term they use for this is the reported essay, which is a decent term, and I appreciate that in the same way that I appreciate the reported memoir as something different from an ordinary memoir. The reported essay marries narrative and analysis. Catherine Boo recently did a portrait of seemingly ordinary people in Louisiana, but it was really focused on the topic A subject of Hurricane Katrina and the policy aftermath of that hurricane. New Yorker staff writers who understand literary journalism and have been around for a while tell me that genuine portraits of ordinary people can't get much traction anymore at the New Yorker, nor at the Atlantic or at some of the other traditional magazines where this kind of material would be published. The younger writers at the Cathedral of the New Yorker, those who are under 40, work more on the intellectual side, they work more as essayists, and they're very comfortable editorializing in their work. Those writers who are over 50 tend to be more purely literary. They write about ordinary people as individual ordinary people rather than as symbols for some social policy. So there's a bit of a split there and a change going on. The powerhouse magazines for literary journalism, the New Yorker, Esquire, even Outside Magazine, which was a recreational magazine that published a great deal of excellent literary journalism for 10 or 15 years, are changing. But all magazines go through cycles as their editorial staff changes over. This is nothing new. But right now, I think American magazines seem a bit fragmented. Writers have been moving around. Michael Paternitti, who is a great contemporary literary journalist, started out at Outside Magazine, moved to Esquire, and did some of his best work there. And now he writes for GQ, or Gentleman's Quarterly, which is essentially a male fashion magazine. And he's somewhat alone there. His movement was following a migrating editor, Peter Griffin. And I think the relationship between writers and their editors is one that should be examined more closely. I know the relationship between Tracy Kidder and Richard Todd is one that cannot be broken. And I think that's happening at magazines. But again, it's an economic issue. The editors migrate, the writers follow them, and everything gets fragmented. I don't see right now the equivalent of a New Yorker cathedral publishing literary journalism in the United States. Well, everybody says that's okay, because there's an upward route for literary journalists to take, which is to write books. And of course, that's pretty much everyone's goal at some level or another. Books have been fertile ground for literary journalists. At one time, not that long ago, a decent magazine writer could get a $300,000 advance on a book for a first book. $300,000, today that's about 250 euros. No,
250,000 euros.
Sorry, the values have changed.
Boy, we devalued that much.
But that happened a few years ago to a fellow I know, Joe Nocera. It was his first book project. It was based on a magazine article that was not quite yet published in Esquire. $300,000 for a 3-year project. He took their money, he took his time, and after 3 years he came back and asked for more money because he wasn't finished yet. But book advances have fallen to the point where they no longer support writers, especially younger writers who are doing a first book. So if you're going to do a project that takes 2 or 3 years, you cannot rely on a major publisher supporting you for that period of time. You have to do it on your own. This has effectively shifted the financial risk from the publishers to the writers. In fact, and one of the New Yorker writers told me this, it may now be easier to publish a book than a magazine article. Because if you're publishing a magazine article, the magazine itself and the editor is assuming the risk of your publication. It's not so much financial, it's what will you write. So they are very critical about what comes in. They want it to match their formula. Book publishers, on the other hand, don't care what you write as long as you're willing to assume the financial risk. If you will do that and take maybe $30,000 for a 3-year project, they'll publish just about anything you bring through the door, as long as it's well written. That transfer of the burden of financial risk, I think, is one of the huge challenges to literary journalism right now. Still, despite all of the difficulties, literary journalists have found a way to publish things. During the New Journalism era, they moved to marginal publications, the newly founded Rolling Stone and the newly founded New York Magazine. They were always finding ways. Today, everyone has their eye on the internet as a transformative medium. And they're very hopeful that literary journalism may become a major force on the internet. It may happen. It may come to pass that we will figure out how to read long narrative on a computer screen. Right now, we won't. Right now, we won't read much beyond 3 screens of material on the internet, and we're much more comfortable with 1 screen of material. That works against literary journalism, but in the future, we might find a way to do this. Even if that comes to pass, the larger challenge is going to be the economic model for journalism on the internet. It's an age-old problem of getting published and earning a living. Information on the web wants to be free, but writers want to be paid. And that conflict is nowhere near being resolved on the internet. But we only need a little bit of spice to make a good meal. If the conditions are right, literary journalism survives. I'm worried about book advances and magazines as a platform right now. But there is some good news out there. And I'd be interested in hearing what's happening with those platforms in other countries. The younger writers, say at the New Yorker, who think of narrative techniques as old school tools that they will use in their own way, they may discover and become interested again in the literary side of the form. They may start, and I would predict that they will start experimenting with voice again, the way good writers always have in the form. The flat narrative voice that is frequently used in their pieces doesn't work well when you're dealing with truly ordinary people. So they may discover that the technical writing problems of voice and tone are constant, and they may be invigorated at some point by the never-ending opportunities to do something that is creative and provides some growth for them. So having mastered the reporting, the in-depth reporting needed for this, they may then turn their attention more toward the literary side. And who knows, they may say, oh, what am I going to do today? Maybe I'll cook up some literary journalism. Look at the spices I have on my shelf here. When we look back at American journalism of the last century or more, the kind of journalism that can be reread, that remains viable and informative, we often find that the leading texts are, in fact, literary journalism. And just to give you an overly long list of who might have written those texts. Today, Jack London, writing about poverty. He also wrote a wonderful book about being a tramp in America. Has been mentioned a couple of times. John Reed, writing about war, Mexico, revolution in Russia. Ernest Hemingway, John Reed, John Dos Passos, writing from Europe in the aftermath of World War I. During the Great Depression, James Agee, Martha Gellhorn, George Orwell, of course, John Hersey on Hiroshima. Cultural Portraits of New York, written by Joseph Mitchell, A.J. Liebling, and Lillian Ross. The great experimental narratives during the 1960s, written by Tom Wolfe, Gay Talese, Truman Capote, Hunter Thompson, Michael Hare, and Joan Didion. And then the contemporary writers who have really understood this form and dedicated themselves to it: Tracy Kidder, Susan Orlean, John McPhee, Jane Kramer, Ted Conover, who's one of my favorite writers, Michael Paternetti, Doug Wynot, and Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc. For me, saying those names in a list like that is, I can hear their voices when I say their names, because they are all very distinctive. It's almost as if I'm reading a menu in a restaurant and I can taste the flavors. At the end of the last century, at New York University, there was an elaborate survey done of knowledgeable people in the field of journalism, asking them to name the top 20th century pieces of journalism. And there were no restrictions put on what kind of journalism this might be. The project was headed by a historian named Mitch Stevens. And I looked at this list, and in fact I looked at it again last night, and I decided I may have undercounted. But of the top 100 works of journalism in the United States during the 20th century, 41 of the 100 works on the list were pieces of literary journalism. And depending on how you define the form, it may have been 45 or 46. So on this list, all forms of journalism were represented. There was muckraking, there was objective journalism, there was investigative reporting. But this time, literary journalism dominated. And in a century where literary journalism was never a dominant form, when we look back at that century, we realize that it was the dominant form, as we can look at it as historians. It was really the main course, not just the spice, as we look back at the 20th century. It provided the kind of intimacy, the subtlety, the artistry that allows us now to feel the times when it was written and to understand. I think literary journalism will always be there. These pieces that were originally just spices at the end of the century become the main course. And I think that will happen again. I'm just not sure where it's going to be or how people will get paid for it. Well, I've outlined a couple of things, but enough of what I think. I'm wondering if you might join in a conversation now and share your thoughts on the challenges and perhaps on the emerging strengths that you see in your countries as literary journalism moves into a new